Welcome to the latest episode of A.T. Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions The Wave of the Future podcast series. From London, I'm Helen Clegg, and my guest today is Cathy Roberson, a market analyst with Transport Intelligence, a niche research organisation on the transportation and logistics industry which is based in the UK. In today's podcast, Cathy talks about the logistics market for high-tech goods, the changes that are happening in the market, the challenges of operating in this market, as well as future trends. Cathy, welcome to our podcast series. It's really great to have you here as a guest today. I'd like to start by asking you to define for us the high-tech logistics market. What does it encompass, and can you give us some indication as to the size of the market?
Thanks, Helen. It's great to be with you all. The high-tech logistics market is a wide and varied market. It encompasses so many components, such as telecommunications, semiconductors, hardware manufacturing, software, electronic components, as well as mobile phones and the smartphones. The logistics part of the high-tech market is one that has been really hard to size. We've done our best to estimate it, and from a global perspective, we've estimated the 2011 market to be valued at over $120 billion. For this year, we're anticipating it to grow to $135 billion, which is about an 11% growth. And much of that growth is due to the rise of tablets and smartphones. By region, Asia Pacific is by far the largest, followed by North America and then Europe. In fact, Asia Pacific, over 90% of high-tech manufacturing is conducted in this region alone.
So, Cathy, those are really interesting statistics about the market. What's been happening recently in this market? Can you share with us some insight onto the recent trends?
Sure. Mergers and acquisitions is big in this market. It's a constantly changing market, so hence that's why we're seeing a lot of mergers and acquisitions occur. And a lot of these are a result of trying to acquire just the latest technology and also to expand into new service offerings. As we know, technology is changing every day. The growth of tablets and smartphones alone is just growing astronomically, and a lot of these high-tech companies are wanting to play a part in this. So, such as that, a lot of them are acquiring the necessary technology to manufacture such items as that. Another trend we're seeing is the fact that past 10 plus years, logistics companies have become very dependent on this industry, particularly as far as transportation of goods from an air freight perspective. And that has become a rather dangerous strategy for a lot of these logistics as well as transportation providers, because as the market has taken a dive, basically, over the past couple of years, we've seen the economy go sour for a lot of us, and the demand has slowed up a good bit. And that has caused a lot of logistics providers to have to rethink their strategy.
Right, and I think also from what I've been reading, there's been some disruptive innovation in this market as well. For example, Apple have come up with a revolutionary supply chain strategy. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what impact it had on the high-tech logistics industry as a whole?
Oh, certainly. Apple has really taken the lead in the high-tech logistics space. Their new CEO, Tim Cook, was their head of supply chain prior to becoming CEO. They have been quite innovative with their approach and quite demanding, to say the least. They have a big control over their suppliers. They've been able to lock out their competitors in numerous ways by placing large orders with these manufacturers, such as Foxconn. And also, as far as transportation goes, this dates back to the 90s when back in the holiday season, they bought up the majority of the air freight space prior to launching one of their products. And it locked out the Compacts, the HPs, and the other competitors out of that air freight space, which resulted in those companies not able to bring their goods to market in time for the holiday season. So hence, Apple was able to succeed in that part.
So, Cathy, as well as recent changes like the ones you just described, there are also risks in this market. From your perspective, what are some of the major risks that logistics players have to contend with today?
The high-tech logistics market is an interesting one, to say the least. It encompasses the whole world. We have manufacturing that's being done in Asia. However, there may be some sub-assembly being conducted in Europe. Final assembly could be done in Mexico or in the U.S. So it's all over the world. And just the way it's spread out results in so many risks. Among the risks could involve such as natural disasters. Oil prices also is a big risk. Counterfeit goods and potential shocks sourcing from suppliers in clusters, again, from Asia in particular, could create a lot of these risks.
You know, you started by talking about natural disasters as a major risk. Now, I know that we've had a number of these in the world. We've had earthquakes, have had tsunamis, and I don't think we really think of them as affecting the supply chain. But as you rightly point out, supply chains are global, so they will have an effect. Do you have examples of how these sorts of natural disasters have really negatively impacted on a high-tech supply chain?
Yes, the high-tech industry as a whole operates on what's known as just-in-time delivery. And a couple of years ago with the Japanese tsunami and earthquake, that resulted in delays in shipments, particularly in the automotive industry, the electronic components that are required for the automotive manufacturers. There was quite a few delays, and as a result, a lot of the Japanese automotive manufacturers suffered financially as a result of this. They weren't able to get their parts in time. What resulted was the fact that some manufacturing facilities had to temporarily shut down. In Thailand, there was a major flooding that occurred, and this is an area where there's a lot of disk drives that are manufactured. And again, as a result, we had several companies report a downturn in quarterly earnings, such as Intel, Seagate, and so on. So natural disasters can have a major, major effect on this industry.
So, Cathy, I want to talk a little bit now about how logistics suppliers are learning to mitigate these risks. What are they doing to address these sorts of changes? And, you know, they can't stop some of the risks like oil prices rising and natural disasters occurring, but they can develop strategies to lessen the impact, right?
Yes, they can. There's several ways they can mitigate these risks. For themselves as a company, again, I had previously mentioned that a lot of these logistics and transportation providers were heavily dependent on the high-tech industry for their revenue growth. Since then, a lot of these providers have divided up their marketing and sales by industry, and they've expanded their service offerings into retail, life sciences, automotive, and so on to try to mitigate this dependency on the high-tech industry. As far as transportation goes, there's been a shift from using air freight to using more ocean freight, and just to offset the high cost, the fuel surcharges that have occurred in the air freight market. Also developing special solutions as well, such as offering repair services, such as UPS here in the U.S. at their Louisville, Kentucky facility. They actually repair Toshiba laptops. They've been doing this for well over 5 years now and have been quite successful in that.
Cathy, you talk about companies developing specialist solutions as a way to mitigate risks. And I know that one strategy is to develop reverse logistics solutions. What do you mean by reverse logistics? You know, can you explain that term to us?
Sure. Reverse logistics encompasses several components, such as recycling, repair, resell, returns, as well as disposition and spare parts logistics. They're all very interesting. This is done on the back end of most companies, and this position itself is a rather interesting one because in the high-tech industry, there are rules and regulations dictated by governments of how to properly dispose of high-tech parts and computer parts, monitors, and such as that. So a lot of distributors, such as Aero Electronics, has moved into this space to manage that type of thing, as well as logistics providers, which is an excellent service to go into.
Do you have any examples of logistics providers that are developing these alternative solutions, such as repair, resale, etc.?
Sure, DHL, one of the largest logistics providers in the world, among their many service offerings includes repair centers. They actually have established quite a few mobile phone repair centers throughout Europe. They also do a lot of work within the spare parts logistics area, as does SEVA. In both cases, they offer this network of strategic stocking locations so that they can get the part delivered to a manufacturer or to a customer within a certain time period, usually less than 24 hours, if not an hour or two.
It's interesting to hear about these different solutions that companies are coming up with to mitigate the risks that are out there in today's environment. So we've talked a little bit about the current conditions and the risks that are out there. What does the future look like for the players in this market? What do you see from your perspective as the trends in the immediate future, Cathy?
That's a good question, Helen. The market is definitely going through a change. As you know, most of the manufacturing for high-tech goods is done in Asia, particularly in China. However, there seems to be a shift going on, moving some of the manufacturing into such markets as Mexico as well as Brazil. In fact, Brazil is becoming an interesting market to look at, particularly as government regulations are dictating that a certain percentage, I believe 60% of goods such as high tech has to be manufactured in that market in order to sell it in the domestic Brazilian market. Another interesting trend that's going on is as we all know, the oil prices have fluctuated over the past few years. The high fuel charges had resulted in transportation costs increasing, thus resulting in higher supply chain costs. And as a result, there is reshoring occurring. A lot of the manufacturing is moving back, again, not only to Mexico, but also to the U.S., surprisingly enough. In fact, over the past week or so, a couple of interesting announcements have been made, one of which is Lenovo, one of China's largest computer manufacturers, announced that they're going to bring some manufacturing into the United States, particularly in North Carolina, where they'll be doing final assembly on some of their laptops there. These products will end up being sold within the U.S. market. The other big announcement was Apple. Apple recently announced that they're going to bring some of their manufacturing back to the United States. It's still too early to know where they're going to manufacture this, but I believe Mr. Cook, who is the CEO of Apple, said that one of the Mac lines is going to be manufactured here in the U.S. It's going to be interesting to see how that evolves. Apple has sourced quite a few of their components here in the U.S., such as Texas Instruments, Samsung, and several others. In fact, the glass on their iPhones is manufactured in Kentucky by Corningware. So, like I said, it's going to be interesting to see if this trend, this high-tech manufacturing shift, continues here in the U.S.
So, Cathy, your insight into future trends of the high-tech logistics market brings us to the end of this podcast. It's clear from what you've told us that the market is continuing to undergo substantial changes and that logistics providers really have to learn to develop mitigating strategies if they want to continue to be competitive. I'm Helen Clegg in London, and I'd like to thank Cathy Roberson for being my guest today. I'd also like to thank our production engineer, Tom Klein, who's located in San Francisco. Thank you for listening to this edition of The Wave of the Future. If you have any comments or questions on this podcast, please tweet them. Our Twitter handle is @ATKPAS. This has been an A.T. Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions podcast production. Join us again next time for the Wave of the Future. And remember, sharing knowledge is powerful.